Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast, authentic chat about medicines, pharmacy and healthcare in the UK.
Pharmacists Jamie, Gimmo and STC take on topical and controversial stories, but keep it edgy yet light-hearted.
Guests share their career-defining drug, song and book, and also share their joyful patient stories. Welcome to the Oral Apothecary Podcast. My name is Jamie Hayes. For this episode, we're joined by Lena Frischlich. Lena is an Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Centre for Digital Democracy at the University of Southern Denmark. We'll welcome Lena in a moment as she shares a drug for our formulary, her career anthem, and recommends a book for the Oral Apothecary Library. This week, we're exploring the challenges of disinformation in healthcare. Our micro-discussion looks at the misrepresentation of GLP-1 agonists on social media. But first, let me welcome my two fellow apothecaries. STC is in Bournemouth and Gimmo is in Cardiff. Welcome both.
Evening.
Afternoon, we should say. This is a ready for the European audience.
It's evening now.
Tea time.
What, 5 o'clock?
It's tea time, 5:30.
Okay, but for the listener, it's too early for us to be having a drink in the pub.
Yeah.
So we're on soft drinks and coffee and tea.
Correct. What have you been up to?
I think since we last spoke, our 5th anniversary episode, which we enjoyed, didn't we? And I think we're still reflecting on 5 years. So have a listen to that if you haven't already. But yeah, I've been to Canada since I last spoke to you. I think I've said on here before, my son's working out there in a ski resort, living his dream. So we ruined it for him by going out to visit. I think
Full state visit?
it was a full state visit, all the family. But yeah, we went to Vancouver to see him and then went over to Banff. And I've got to say, Banff in the winter is possibly one of the most incredible places I've ever seen. So yeah, fantastic trip. That was a week or so ago. So I'm over it now and back, all guns blazing.
Yeah, busy. Yeah, love a bit of Canada. And as you know, Jamie and I are going out to Montreal next month. So yeah, I've been busy at work. I've got my trainee pharmacist with me at the moment, a guy called Jonas, who's from Eritrea. First person I've ever worked with from Eritrea. Very nice. And my key word, I like simple words, don't I, to keep banging the same drum. It's been process, because he's learning to be an independent prescriber. So I keep telling him that don't worry about the knowledge. It's all about the process at this point. So yeah, we've been banging the drum for process a lot. And the other thing I learned about a new addiction in the last couple of weeks, it's not a medicine. It's to do with clothing. Seems to afflict the females. It's called Vinted. So my wife and my daughter seem to now be addicted. And when I go to Pilates, all the ladies are always talking about Vinted and how they've had to keep their phone downstairs so that they don't try and look at it when they're supposed to be going to bed. So I don't know if Lena's into Vinted, but apparently it's a thing.
Not just ladies. Yeah. I've just bought a pair of navy blue Fred Perry shoes for £13. So thank you very much, Vinted.
Right, okay.
And the boys have been selling on Vinted for a little while as well, Steve.
Yeah, I think you're behind the curve, Steve.
I definitely am. I don't really do clothing.
You've been distracted by AI too much, haven't you?
Yeah, I have. What about you, Jay? What have you been up to?
So, a couple of speaking and coaching gigs around the country. I've been to Birmingham, London, Bristol this weekend. On Friday, I treated myself to some CPD with a Hot Topics Day in London. So a bit of sat there, quite nostalgic for National Prescribing Centre Therapeutic Update Days, as NB Medical was the days that I went on and spent a day of having a load of therapeutics update thrown at me, and you could sort of try and, like taking a drink from a fire hydrant. That's what the information mastery boys used to say. They throw it at you and some of it may stick. And then we stayed in London for a weekend of culture. So I went to see a Banksy exhibition on Saturday and then the Tracy Emin exhibition on Sunday.
Oh, get you.
Yeah, indeed. Both were fantastic.
I believe NB Medical don't use any AI slop. Is that right?
Correct. It was a good day, to be fair. I enjoyed it. Nice to be sat in the audience for a change. Okay, let's move on now. Great pleasure to welcome Associate Professor Dr. Lena Frischlich to the Oral Apothecary. Lena has a background in media psychology and communication science. Her research focuses on the interplay between the digital realm of human cognition and behaviour. She is particularly interested in staging effects of manipulative online communication, such as propaganda, disinformation or hate speech, and how to strengthen democracy in the digital realm. She's published lots and lots of papers. She's an associate editor at a number of journals, a guest editor too. 2024, look, she was elected to the Commission of the Centre for Advanced Internet Studies. Lena, welcome to the pod.
Thank you so much for having me. And your weekend reminds me that I really should go back to London in a not too distant future.
Very good. So, Lena, I suspect your expertise must be in high demand given your area of focus. Steve and I were in the audience in Copenhagen almost a year ago to the day as you delivered a keynote on navigating the challenges of disinformation in healthcare. We sat there with a couple of thousand others, I think, and absolutely loved it. Can you start off for our listener? Just give us a summary, really, of what you shared with us that day, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, thank you so much. So indeed, my research is at the intersection of psychology and communication. And when we talk about mis and disinformation, but also how the digital transformation changes the field, then these are, of course, core disciplines. We're not the only disciplines that matter, but mis and disinformation really play a big role in both disciplines right now. And I was invited to Copenhagen, which was a super big stage and a really big honor to talk a little bit about what is actually misinformation, how prevalent is it, what makes it so challenging for healthcare providers and specifically for people that work really at the front line of the medical system, and what we can do to foster democratic resilience. And to do that, it's also important to understand what makes people susceptible to misinformation. So I try to give an overview about all these different topics and provided some findings from the internet about how misinformation currently looks like across social media platforms.
And very good it was too. Again, Steve and I sat there, texting Gimmo actually to say, oh, we must invite this expert.
I love it when
pod.
you do that when you're at exotic conferences and I'm at home and you're texting me. But yeah,
yeah. Well, it's make you feel part of the group, Gimmo.
I mean, I've seen some of the slides and stuff, and I think it's, the stuff in there we could talk about all day. You're a psychologist, aren't you, by background, and I guess on this pod, we've talked a lot in the past about behavioural psychology and how it's used to. I mean, we've tried to frame it how we could use it to influence better prescribing and decision making. But I guess you see it. You see psychology used, I suppose, for evil, but to misinform people.
I think an important point is that when we look at what makes people susceptible to misinformation, these are often not that different pathways or behaviors. It's not as if there's this kind of spontaneous mutation and innocent people are turned into these like misinformation zombies, but instead misinformation is often a communication process where a specific story reaches a more or less susceptible audience, and it's often very human patterns that make us susceptible to misinformation. That can actually happen to most of us. So one factor that plays a big role or has been shown in many studies by now is that's also a question of how carefully, how elaborated do we engage with it, information we encounter online, right? And I mean, normally if you check your phone, you might be at a bus stop or you might have the kids around. You're very often in a situation where you do not engage in careful processing. And then you encounter an environment where you might see entertaining videos or content that is a bit fear-arousing, very sensational. And this triggers some processes that might not be the best to actually think about. Do I believe that information? What is the credible evidence behind that? How does that fit to my worldview? And research has shown that the less careful we process information, the more we rely on our kind of gut feeling and intuition only, not saying that gut feeling and intuition is always bad, the more likely it is that we fall for misinformation content. And especially if this content taps into the things we already want to believe. So we're much better in detecting misinformation that kind of lets our political opponents or people that we don't like appear in a bad light. And we're not as critical when it's content that actually gives us the feeling that we are on the right side of history or that our group is superior to other groups. So these are very basic human processes, but they are fed or interact with an information environment in which it also has become easier to encounter these kind of misleading information.
I think that's really helpful. It's a bit like when you get scammed, isn't it? They get you when you're vulnerable. So like you've just said about when you might be taking that information in. I'd never really thought of it like that, but it's a really good way of explaining it. And of course, I'm guessing that where people are trying to spread misinformation, they're doing it on purpose, just like in relation to scammers. And so it's not surprising, is it, that we do fall foul of it.
But I think it is important to know that there are these two types of misinformation we distinguished. One is the more like misleading, unintentional kind of stuff. So for example, you might truly believe that unicorns are there, that they wait for you, and you tell this story to your friend. That is technically a form of misinformation, at least as far as the evidence is now. Is not very good for unicorns. I'm sorry to disappoint, but it doesn't look very good. But at the same time, you might not tell the story because you want to deceive someone or scam someone or earn money on that, but because you truly believe that. But then on the other hand, we also indeed have like strategic disinformation that really wants to deceive people, and that can be due to political reasons, but also due to financial reasons. I mean, telling false stories can also just be a business model.
And I think in your slides, I think you're explaining that when we think about bots in social media, is that exclusively to do with disinformation, or are bots used for misinformation as well?
That's an interesting question. So we recently suggested that if we want to understand misinformation, we need to look at the complex ecosystem through which that perpetuates. And we have creators of this content, but then we also have spreaders. And one of these spreaders can be a bot. And now it helps to understand a little bit how these bots work. So on the one hand, they can simply listen to specific keywords. It's a very simple bot. And then just share everything that fits to that keyword. So assume you created a bot that only listens, sounds very human, but monitors the Twitter conversation. And whenever someone speaks about pharmacies, the bot shares the content and collects all the pharmacy content. So within that content, there might be misinforming content, right? But we would not necessarily say that the bot is a disinforming bot, because that's not the technology behind it. At the same time, people can also use these automated accounts to really amplify misinformation stories, to use that to simulate popularity or create virality around posts. And that is especially the case if they earn money for clicks, because many of the social media algorithms work in a way that when content is already viewed by a lot of people, the algorithm thinks, okay, many people might be interested in that, right? And then it's recommended to more people, so it gains more clicks. And if you can monetize that clicks, for example, views on YouTube, then there's a economic interest to push view numbers and to get into these like trending topic statistics or recommended views. So the bot itself, or the use of automated agents, is only one part in a larger puzzle. And in the end, very few of these bots are really autonomous. You typically still have someone that set the bot up or the bot army up and had a specific intention behind that.
I suppose it's been exacerbated, isn't it? Because you say, well, you're talking about bots, but the technology now is just incredible, isn't it? You know, we're fast approaching a space where you literally can't believe anything you see on the screen. I mean, even now, Steve could be AI generated, and we might not know it. I doubt it, but it's possible. But I mean, I fell for one the other day. I forwarded an Instagram post to my son. It was about the Iran war. My dad and he sent me back and said, "Dad, that's a clip from a computer game." I thought, "Oh God!" And so I felt like an idiot. But it's so simple, and so you've got artificially generated voices, people. To the point where it's impossible to believe anything. So I know we talk about teaching critical appraisal skills, but even with critical appraisal skills, it's getting difficult, isn't it?
Yes, and it always has been difficult. I think when we look at the history of how people engaged with media over time, we see that whenever a new medium enters the stage, there is a phase of adaptation and finding new ways of handling this. So the first moving pictures, you surely know the stories of people that were super afraid after going to the cinema and then a train just coming directly to them from the screen. So we are also, again, in one of these like bigger transformation processes related to artificially generated content, but also actors and voices and images. And we had artificially generated text already quite a while. I think the big thing at the moment is indeed videos and pictures. And it is also something that is challenging. And the reason for that is that our brain processes pictures often faster than text, and also often in a very direct manner, which made a lot of sense evolutionarily. Like, I mean, if you walk through the jungle and there's a tiger jumping at you, you don't have time to really reflect about that. You respond with arousal, with fear, with anxiety. And that is what some of these modern AI-generated images also do, especially in times of warfare, but also when we think about health and pharmacological interventions that often meets people in very vulnerable emotional situations anyways. And then you put these kind of visual informations on there that directly is processed as threatening or as emotionally arousing. And all of that again creates a situation where you might not carefully reflect about the stuff you see. And I think that's the big challenge. When we look at the statistics, for now, we see that we do have this increase in AI slop, but not like the amount of really well-generated AI content is not overrunning the internet at the moment. Might be that that changes, but a lot of these content is actually, you can see that it is sloppy and horrible, and you see the mistakes if you take your time. But then if you look at a video from a recent war or conflict, you're probably afraid anyways or concerned. It's also an emotionally horrible time. Then you will probably not carefully reflect about that, right? And that indeed makes it very difficult and very challenging at the moment, also to find good ways of supporting both media literacy, but also trust in established information providers, right? So it's not only about distrusting everything that's out there. And studies have actually shown if we issue like super dramatic warnings about misinformation, people respond with distrusting everything, but that is also not justified. I mean, most established media outlets are nowadays online, and of course they can also make mistakes. Pharmacists can make mistakes, researchers can make mistakes, but we also have mechanisms on trying to correct our mistakes, right? So we need to find a good balance between navigating environments of trustworthy information sources, especially in times of crisis, and at the same time also staying a little bit of critical and alerted and not trusting everything we see out there. And that's the same with the spams, right? We talked about that and the scamming.
So, Lena, when Steve and I were sat in the audience, and again, as you're giving your keynote, I guess you sense this or feel this, because when you put a slide up and I don't know, 1,000 people put their phones up to take a photo of your slide, you think, oh, right. And so that happened for a couple of yours, and one of the terms that Steve and I turned to each other was information pollution. Mm-hmm. But the slide that I remember that everybody got their phones out for was the typical techniques of science denial. So that was Flick, wasn't it? Do you want to just briefly describe what that was talking about?
Absolutely. And all credit for that goes to the wonderful John Cook, who developed these as a way of discussing how especially climate science is delegitimized already since a very long time, and before we even like talked about the internet. We have seen these techniques when it comes to the health dangers of tobacco, but also to climate change. And indeed, the English abbreviation is FLIC, and includes examples or techniques such as using fake experts. And he actually has a wonderful blog that I can highly recommend, where he also has figures and visual comic-like depictions of how that can look like. So fake expert would be you getting a brain surgery, and then someone comes in and says, don't worry, I'm a computer scientist. And I think that explains very good the idea behind that. Of course, people can have different ways of gaining knowledge and insights, and I don't want to devaluate all of these ways, but there are some situations where you actually want someone who has invested years of his or her life into learning this specific profession, right? If you get a cardio surgery, you do not want to have someone who normally repairs your toilet coming in saying, well, actually, I listened to a podcast. I think I can also do that. So that's the technique of pseudo-experts, people that present themselves as experts, but often did not go the hard way of learning it, right? And then I need to translate it back to the German because the acronym is a bit...
So logical fallacies is next.
Yes, so the next one is the logical fallacies. And here you have examples like the strawman argument. So assume you are in a conflict and someone goes up to you and says, and you say, I don't know, you want to advertise for a specific medication. And then the person says, yeah, but you want to forbid that people drink herbal tea. And you're like, no, that was never the idea. I just said herbal tea is maybe not a replacement for, I don't know, aspirin against a headache or something like that. And that's a classical strawman argument. So the person on the other side attacks an argument that sounds much more intense than the one you had, but therewith creates a situation where it's really hard to argue against it, right?
Yeah, so Lena, just on that, I think you used an example about this logical fallacies where I think it was Robert Kennedy, isn't it, in the States, who was basically trying to say that somebody in my family was trying to get off an SSRI antidepressant and it was harder than getting off heroin. Yeah. And that was one of the examples that you used.
Yeah, and the idea behind that is a false analogy. So Robert Kennedy Jr., the current health minister of the US, has a very specific understanding of health. That is not always...
That's a nice way of putting it.
Evidence-based medicine. But he also is very good in telling emotional stories about that. And I think that is one reason why people feel very attracted to him. Maybe not the one of you, but he has quite a lot of people that find his message very convincing. But what he, for example, did, he said, well, he had a family member for whom it was more complicated to get away from antidepressive medicine than from heroin. And that sounds very it sounds as if you can feel it, right? I mean, it is his personal story. He knows the person and you can kind of feel the suffering. But the problem is that while heroin in the human body is very easy to get rid of, actually, a depression is a severe psychological disease that is not related to a single stimulants through a pharmaceutical product or through a drug, right? So you don't get away from antidepressants, but you have to overcome depression as a severe psychological disease. So while it can look as if one is harder than the other, the reason for that is it is a very different process. You're basically comparing apples not only to oranges, but at least an ananas.
Bananas. Yes. Okay.
So next one, we'll go take you through these. Look, and Steve's put the slide up for us. Impossible expectations, Lena.
Yeah, I think there the idea is, or a typical technique is that you kind of move the goalpost. So you always demand more evidence. And that is something we see very often, for example, in the context of dysfunctional conspiracy theories. So people do not believe that there's evidence against something. So even if you have a lot of research showing that a certain medication does not produce mass side effects. So look, for example, at the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We had a lot of conspiracy theories about the vaccination, and a lot of people said online that we would actually observe mass dying individuals simply based on the vaccination, not the pandemic, not the virus, but that the vaccination would kill more people than the pandemic. Well, this did not happen. I mean, it's a couple of years later, and clearly we do not see an extinct world. So we have quite a good assumption that this has not been true. And still people then demand more evidence to show that this is not happening, often having unrealistic high expectations towards the medical system, but also towards the political system, something like 100% certainty, for example. So when we look at the COVID-19 discussion around the vaccines, the cases that have been documented of people that have suffered as consequence of the vaccine, or that have had side effects, or that didn't feel very well afterwards, they are a very small proportion of all the millions and millions of people that got this drug. But the idea of the impossible expectations is that they want to have ruled out even these like last cases or the last uncertainties, even though there is never 100% certainty in science, right? I mean, we're a self-correcting system. There might be things changing over time, and we might learn new things over time.
I think this, I don't know if the same thing happened in Denmark, but is this what happened with vaccines and things like MMR, where it was impossible to it was almost impossible to argue against the cases that are being made because of some of the things you say, and the way that the evidence was presented. It's very difficult to prove that negative.
Yeah, I feel it's also a general challenge in presenting principles of verification and falsification and using that as difference. Let me give you another example. The belief in the Earth being flat, the flat earther theory, which there are still people out there that do believe that the Earth is flat, and they often collect single pieces of information that they cherry pick, which is, by the way, the next technique.
Nicely done.
See what you did there?
To kind of show that they are in line with this assumption. And that is a fundamental different way of how scientists approve theories or approach theories, because we often use the principle of falsification instead. And let me get back to my beloved example of the unicorn. The idea of falsification is that only because no one has ever seen a unicorn, it is not 100% impossible that there is a unicorn. I mean, it could live under sea or on one mountain where you never see someone, right? It could be possible. So verifying that something does not exist is incredibly complicated. So there was this philosopher, Karl Popper, who said, but actually, if we formulate a question slightly different and then reject this formulation, then we might actually believe in the other information a bit more. That sounds super complicated, but assume you want to see, or your assumption is that there are only white horses in the world. The second you see a black horse or brown horse, your hypothesis is rejected, and you know, okay, my assumption there are only white horses was false. The second we see a unicorn, the assumption there are no unicorns is also false, but as I said, currently evidence not on our side. So what scientists often do is try to formulate hypotheses and test hypotheses that go into the all horses are white direction. So for example, vaccines do not have an effect, or people that are vaccinated or not vaccinated have the same severity of symptoms. And in the moment that we do reject this assumption, for example, because people that have been vaccinated do better off, then we can reject this equality assumption, and it gives us a bit more trust in the idea that there might be an actual effect or difference. So it's not about collecting things that confirm our worldview, which is also one of the mechanisms that makes us susceptible to misinformation, right? So we are better in perceiving stuff that confirms our worldview, but that is what scientists actually not try to do. We're a bit masochistic in that. We try to reject our worldview and let the world tell us that we're wrong, simply to provide better insights over time.
So we've had fake experts, logical fallacies, impossible expectations, cherry picking, and then final one
is conspiracy theories, which leads us back to the topic of a lot of the stuff we saw during COVID-19. And let me take maybe 1 minute to explain what a conspiracy theory actually is. It sounds so obvious because, of course, in the first step, it's a theory about a conspiracy, like bad people doing something in the shadows, and that is harmful for society or a larger collective. But the thing is, we have, of course, seen over the course of history that these things happen, right? I mean, Epstein, like, there has been a lot of powerful people that did really bad things to a lot of innocent young girls. So not all assumptions about powerful people doing bad things are per se wrong. But when we talk about conspiracy theories in a narrower sense, we mean a very specific type of conspiracy myth or conspiracy theories proper. And they have 3 additional characteristics. They have an unrealistic power assumption, and there's actually physical research showing that the larger the conspiracy theory, the more people involved, and the longer it takes, the more unrealistic that people never talk about it. And just imagine you have like all global world leaders plus their partners, plus their affairs, their children, and some of them might get drunk once in a while, and no one ever talks for 30 years. Super unrealistic if you know people. Small conspiracies, like 50 people, small reach, slightly more likely. Not necessarily true, but more likely compared to these like big scale things. The second important aspect is that these conspiracy theories proper often assume a Manichaean worldview. That sounds wild, but it basically means the assumption that my group are the good ones. We are always innocent, we are always pure, and the other side, the enemy, is inevitably wicked, pervert, and dangerous, and thus we are in this kind of apocalyptic battle. And then the third part is that these like narrower conspiracy theories, they are immune to falsification. So even in light of counter evidence, there's always just a bigger conspiracy explanation behind that. So for example, people did not die because of the COVID-19 vaccine because they are kind of herded for 20 years and then they will die at a specific moment in the future for whatever goal.
So again, my recollection from when we were in Copenhagen was you showed these incredible pictorial infographics.
Which I found on the internet, yes.
Deep state mining projects. And there was a whole conspiracy one all about pharma, and we can perhaps put it in the show notes. And I don't think it was there that you said it, but I've heard this said recently, and it reminded me of it when I either read or heard somebody say, pharma is your dealer, not your healer. And it immediately made me think of that pictorial that you showed in Copenhagen. We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, just be aware you basically disseminate propaganda, and I'm not sure if it's copyrighted by the persons who created it. They do share it freely for distribution on Etsy. But consider if you want to invite them into your podcast and comment section. But the idea behind the graphic, and I think that is that ties back to conspiracy beliefs, is that often everything is connected to each other, and there are these like dark forces that sit behind everything. And that's the same for this figure. It shows how basically big pharma is related to different drugs, but also to death, to unhealthy eating, to climate pollution, to money laundering, and they're like wild things that all hang together.
Yeah, wild, I think, is the right word.
Yeah, it's really wild. But also the figure you see, you have like the good alternative medical scene on one side, and then big pharma, death, and basically concentration camps on the other side. So that's really this like Manichaean idea. It's not a under this conditions for this person, this might be a good approach, or this might be a better approach, a very balanced view, but it's really this like opposing poles that kind of force you into either being part of the forces of good or the forces of evil. And here we are back to the manipulation behind it, because that basically takes away your freedom of choice. Your freedom of choice saying, in my personal health journey, I maybe want to combine some of these things. I might lean into one direction, but also be open to learn from each other. And that is what these kinds of Manichaean worldviews make impossible. And as that, they also stand in the way of progress and better thinking, because we can learn from different approaches, right? But we want to do it in a way that creates trustworthy information also for the public and for the people that need our support.
Yeah. And I guess we should finish up at this point by you just explaining what you also used in your presentation is, okay, this is all pretty, deep and worrying, but what are the countermeasures? So you talked about how pharmacists and other health professionals generally have very good standing in the community. People tend to believe what they say, etc. But perhaps you could just talk us through the fact sandwich, as you called it, because I think that's probably another takeaway message for listeners about how do we help, if we're health professionals or others, how do we try to debunk some of the misinformation and disinformation.
Yeah, I think one thing that I find important is to say we often look at the individual media users, and that's good, and we can indeed do something to contribute to a more healthy information environment around us. And one of these things is that we really reflect about the stuff we share online, and there's this kind of Socratian approach, always asking ourselves, is that really true what I share? Am I the person who needs to share that now? And do I have to share it now, or can I actually take time to think about that? And where does this urgency come from? I'm not paid for being a disseminator, so why do I feel I need to share it right now? I think that's one thing we can do. And then the other thing is indeed, if we want to discuss with people about misperceptions or misinformation, it's always good to not focus on the misinformation, but focus on the actual fact. And the reason for that is that if we take away an explanation from our mental models, we need to provide actual reliable and useful information instead, because else we just take away a pillar, and that from card houses doesn't work very well. So the fact sandwich is based on this idea. We start with the fact and we really explain what is the state of evidence, what do we know? And then we mention the misinformation rather shortly, and we explain why this is a misinformation. Just going out there and telling people you're dumb, you're bad informed, and trust me because I have a white coat on, that might have worked with my grandmother. It does not work anymore today for many, many people. And then you end up with, again, explaining what is the current state of evidence and what is the useful information for the other side. But I also want to mention that we often focus only on the individual side, but misinformation is embedded in a larger societal system. So if we really want to work on that, we also need to create conditions in which people have trustworthy relationships with the healthcare providers. So that's also about having time to talk to each other, to build a relationship in which people make positive experiences, including with the medical system, and in which politicians, media, scientists all adhere to true standards, right? We are also responsible for the information we provide, and we have to be trustworthy if we demand trust from others.
That's all really good advice. And I'm sitting here thinking another thing we've covered in the past is that sort of dual process thinking, isn't it? In system 1 and system 2. And I think a lot of this is about actually being conscious that a lot of the decision making we're making around this is when we're in system 1, that automatic thing. And actually, perhaps before I share a video of a jet being shot down to my son, I'll try and shift myself into system 2 and be a bit more critical. That's one of the messages I'm taking home is be a bit more conscious about shifting ourselves into system 2. And maybe that's one of the things that could happen in practice, is there are more prompts and more ways of doing that.
I do think so, but also, I mean, we live in super complex times, and it is also unrealistic that you like handle the kids, do the laundry, do your 40-hour work shift, and reflect about each single source in the same amount of detail as a professional journalist. So we also really need to invest in a good media system that helps us navigate through this jungle. And we have to create trustworthy audience relationships as media practitioners.
Perhaps just to sum up on that, we went to another presentation in Copenhagen by Dr. Suzanne McCarthy, and she described the oral apothecary as a positive influencer in the world of medicines. So we're doing something right. And we talked about this in our 5-year anniversary episode about how we take it really seriously what we do on here. We like to, be lighthearted sometimes, but, we realize that what we say can matter. And that's really what you're saying, isn't it? If you're a health professional, think before you speak or post.
Yes, especially if you're a health professional, but also really speak to the people in your community. I mean, there are some spaces like TikTok or YouTube where a lot of the information that you find online is actually not factual. And that is because it's very easy to just grab a microphone and talk about something that you have tried out, but you're, again, not an expert. You're the sanitary guy who just tried out holding a knife and now believes he's a surgeon.
So, Lena, hold those thoughts, because we'll come on to some of those conversations now after Steve takes you through your 3 choices.
The Oral Apothecary is sponsored by Jamie Hayes Executive Coaching and OneLessPill.com.
So, Lena, we really, really could speak all day on this. This is so fascinating. Yeah. And I heard some of it before, but I'm still very excited about it all. Okay, so we'll take a slight break here and we'll ask you about all guests on the Oral Apothecary podcast get to give us 3 things. And the first one is what we like to call a desert island drug or a memory-evoking drug. And it's something that evokes a powerful memory for you. So it's not something that will save you on a desert island. And so I think you've thought about this. So maybe give us your thoughts and the story around why you picked the drug that you did. So what would you like to offer us for the Oral Apothecary formulary?
I actually would choose the polio vaccine. And the reason for that is that my mom, when I was a child, had a very good friend who did not get a polio vaccine, but get the late disability coming from a polio infection. So when I was a child, which is not that long ago, I actually knew someone who back then was a very old woman from my perspective. She was super young, I know now, but back then she felt very old, who had like daily pain and struggles because of that. And that was actually the first time that I learned something like a zip can prevent something that powerful. So I think that was the first time in my life, and I might have been like 4 or 5 back then, that I really realized how powerful medicine can be. Okay, well, it's a nice short and sweet story, but yeah, go ahead, Gimme. No, just saying we've mentioned it already, but it fits in with your topic perfectly as well, isn't it? Is that, that memory of the effects of polio has not gone, but it's disappearing, and that fuels then the conspiracy theories about, why are you making us take a drug for polio when no one's ever got polio? I think it makes it easier, at least, right? We also know that misinformation benefits when we're not well informed about a topic. If we already have a good mental model and experiences and knowledge about a topic, it's much harder to kind of infuse our mind with these small false stories. I'm pretty sure you're much less susceptible to medical misinformation than me, for example. I'm not a medical professional, but I might know a little bit more about what AI can do and cannot do. So I might be a bit less susceptible to some of the fancy claims about AI technology at the moment.
Okay, well, we've had vaccinations before, but we haven't had polio, so that will definitely go into the oral apothecary formulary.
Sorry, Steve, only a quickie. Look, I've just got this week's BMJ has just landed, and page 2 of the BMJ talks about how the UK lost its measles elimination status in January. And so the BMJ podcast has just been chatting about that, but that just shows you that over the last 15 years or so that vaccination rates have been steadily declining. So
I also really believe people have the right to make individual choices, but it also shows we do not inform very well. And very often that is a communication question. And we need to build trust for especially measures that protect the most vulnerable in our society, and where we need the communal effort of everyone together doing something to protect children and the weak ones.
Okay, the second thing we're after is a career anthem for the Oral Apothecary Spotify playlist. And if you're listening from part of Europe, knowing that Lena is our guest, it really is on Spotify. So what would you like to offer us for that?
Elton John, I'm Still Standing.
Okay. Yeah, classic track. And why?
So first of all, being in academia also means you move around quite often. You're faced with a lot of rejections. A lot of times, as I already said, the world tells you that your hypothesis was not correct. And there's also a lot of political pressure, especially on misinformation research recently, right? So I think there are good ways of always saying, despite all odds, we're still there, we're still standing. And that is not only my personal history, there also is a very personal part behind that song that is maybe not audience ready. But I feel this human power of looking in the face of odds and adversaries and saying, and I'm still here and I'm still proceeding with that. As you already said, I'm a trained psychologist. So as part of that, I also did my clinical internship in a trauma clinic with people that had some of the worst stories I've ever heard in my life. And they were so resilient. They still stood up for their family. They fought all these adversaries and still they kept on smiling. They kept on being there for each other despite all these hard conditions. And this human ability to be reactant, to be still standing is something that keeps on fascinating me and that I really think we all need to support because it's such a big human power.
Amen to that. Okay, and the third thing then is a book choice for our listener for the Oral Apothecary Library.
That was a hard one, I must say. And that is not only because I have too many books, but also because I was thinking, should that be more a scientific book? And then there it is actually likely one of the first books about propaganda from 1948 from Harold Laswell, a short history of propaganda, which is one of the first books that actually looks at political propaganda, and it's still eerily current or timely, so you can still learn quite a lot of that. But then I saw that your library also has non-fiction books, so then of course it has to be a book by Terry Pratchett, not only because this is a British podcast, but because he explained everything in the world amazing. So I actually learned today that there's one Terry Pratchett book I did not read, and it is about journalism. It's called The Truth. So now it is on my reading list. But I also just recommend whatever from Terry Pratchett to everyone because he has such a good way of bringing things to the point, be it about academia, about the powerless and the powerful, and about the contested situation of society more generally.
I'm a massive Terry Pratchett fan, and he talks about misinformation a lot, doesn't he? And about
Exactly.
about how technology misinforms the
Yes.
masses and stuff like that. The truth is about the establishment of a newspaper, isn't it? It's fantastic.
Yeah, I ordered it like 10 minutes before the podcast. I was like,
always
it can't
great.
be, I cannot know it. Because he also has a so good way of summarizing human conditions in a very like appreciative way, but you still learn so much about the world we're living in. So massively, the turtle moves, Terry Pratchett endorsement.
I think that's a first for the Oral Apothecary, that the person has picked a book that they've not even read. But the philosophy of why you've picked it because of the author speaks to, and I knew that Gimmo is a Terry Pratchett fan, so he immediately was straight out the blocks with, he always talks about misinformation. So that's a great pick. So The Truth by Terry Pratchett goes into the Oral Apothecary library.
Makes total sense. Our micro discussion next. In the archives of pharmacology, and I may come to Lena for some help with some pronunciations in a moment, Lara Elizabeth Propfy and Roland Seifert, we'll go with that, share their research on the misrepresentation of semaglutide in social media. So Lena did stray into this territory a little bit before her choices, but Steve or Gimmo, which one of you wants to sort of start us off and give Lena a little break while we open up the discussion on what you thought? And
Well, I'll start and then Steve can come in, because I think I mentioned to you one of the things that struck me when I was in Canada was how prolific the advertising was for weight loss drugs. It was everywhere. It was on every billboard. It was in the corridors of the tube station. And I suppose that struck me because in the UK, and I don't know if it's the same in Denmark, we haven't got direct-to-consumer marketing. And so when I read this study, of course, one way around direct-to-consumer marketing is the way that influencers and stuff are used on social media. So I found this, on the one hand, not surprising, but on the other hand, quite scary at just the level of misrepresentation that was going on out there. So it talks about, it reframes semaglutide as a lifestyle drug. It misrepresents how it works. It underreports adverse effects, but also plays into those common tropes that adverts do about it's a cure for your unhappiness, basically. So yeah, I think probably wasn't that surprised by it, but it's good to see the sort of academic rigor behind what we probably all feared as well. I don't know what you thought, Steve.
Yeah, so we thought it was a good one to do because obviously we've spoken about skinny jabs before, and it was incredible, really, when I read it. Just for the academics, they basically tried to look at all posts that were in German or English that had at least 1,000 views to do with semaglutide, otherwise known as Ozempic or Wegovy, and they had to have had 1,000 likes or 1,000 views. And I suppose what came out to me was just basically that YouTube is actually, of all the social media outlets, it seems, and if this study is, maybe Lena can tell us whether this has been backed up in other studies, that in this particular case, if you want to go and get some information as a punter, you're better off going to YouTube, and you should go nowhere near Instagram and TikTok. And the evidence from the actual data just showed just how shocking on Instagram and TikTok, how little was even said about anything, and that the people were mainly, in the majority, female and were users who'd used it for weight loss and influencers. And yet, if you looked at YouTube, you're much more likely to get somebody who was a health professional or somebody who was doing a news piece. And that was my takeaway message from this.
I think what I found really interesting about the study, because it also reflects what we see otherwise, is that older platforms are often better taken off by established actors. So YouTube and Facebook have been around since quite a long time, and by now most established politicians but also health institutions have understood that people are there. But till we start taking off these platforms, the youth is already far away. They are on TikTok for now, likely they already chat with ChatGPT, which makes it even harder to reach them. So we have a very dynamic development in the uptake of platforms, and often a very slow approach of more established information providers. And the reason for that is that they also have kind of a traditional way of get their information over, right? They are covered in a newspaper, they have access to the television. In contrast, if you want to become influential outside of the circles, especially if you have a very fringy attitude or opinion, you cannot just call the Times and say, I want to say that Ozempic is the next diet trend. They will just not publish it. They have editorial control. So you have to go to these emerging platforms where you find and build your own audience, right? So we often have extreme views, fringe views, being early adopters of new technologies. And that creates a data and information void that users of these platforms are then exposed to. And that also really means we need more credible information on these platforms. But at the same time, we know healthcare professionals do not have time. They struggle. The news industry lacks money. So we really are in a challenging situation with this like platform fragmentation out there.
Yeah, much the same as what you just said. I picked up on one thing, and it was something I remember. I was in a yellow card pharmacovigilance meeting
I know what you're going to say.
Years ago, and they were getting very excited that social media was going to bring them new data. Because patients that receive medicines, they go into self-help groups and patient groups, and then that's where they share in real world language what they're experiencing. And I remember the pharmacovigilance community and the medicine safety community got very excited because the way that the patients were describing these new sort of experiences didn't always mirror what was in the respective data sheet for the pharmaceuticals. And so they do, I think they reference it a little bit in the misleading health information section of the paper, but they do just count and say, but that ship seems to have sailed with this paper a little bit because it's just, there's the table in the paper that...
Well, what they say, isn't it, is that user report experiences may help to detect previously unknown side effects.
Yeah.
And you could actually see how AI could actually help with that in terms of scraping social media.
And that's what they were doing about 10 years ago, I think. They were sending these sort of, if scraping is the term, going through all the sort of the online chat forums and discussion groups and coming up with a new data set that they were getting quite excited about in patients' own language. Steve?
There's also got some fascinating tables, isn't it, where they look at all the posts and... there's one that got 1.2 million likes on TikTok. Also, my favorite subject, as you know, is the probability of AI modification. They did a test on that. 93.9% on Instagram.
Yeah, though I think if I recall the technology they used correctly, it is a score that ranges from 0 to 100. So 50% is exactly in the middle. So having a likelihood of 63% of modification is actually not super high.
No, this was 93%.
Yeah, no, I think it was actually 63. Was it 90? I remember something.
The
60,
Instagram
70.
one. Yeah, 93.9 probability of AI modification.
Yeah, though that also refers to beauty filters, which are super common on Instagram, but not implemented on YouTube videos. So yes, I do think we need to take this serious and we need to take AI modification serious, but we also must be aware that Instagram is a platform that had modified images since a long time. Back then they called it Photoshops, then they called it filters, which is of course also always a form of computer manipulation. It's just a different algorithm behind that. But I think it is important to be aware that different platforms also cater to different needs. And Instagram has a very specific aesthetic thing that also serves a different function in the audience compared to Facebook or Twitter.
But that's why this is so worrying, isn't it? Because this is a type of drug that is being then put across. I mean, again, there's another quote from an Instagram post, and they use it in their table, and it says, absolutely safe for health. no reported side effects. How are we dealing with this stuff? I mean, it's frightening when you actually stop and think about it and you look at things like this. And this will just be one of many studies, I'm sure, looking at the social media landscape around skinny jabs. And I was appalled when I read it.
So I will come in with a word that we thought we might use today, but we haven't used yet, but I'll use it now. And I've got a paper in front of me on workplace bullshit, defined as taking place when colleagues make statements at work with no regard for the truth. And then it goes on to explain the different types. And as bullshitters don't care what the truth is, this affords them freedom to say whatever it takes to further their agenda. They make the distinction between bullshitters and liars. And so it didn't come up, but many of the comments that we've just talked about on social media regarding GLP-1s in this case, it fits into that category. And I just need to push back against Steve a little bit on yes, YouTube came out not as bad as Insta and TikTok.
It wasn't great.
Yeah, they're all shocking, aren't they? YouTube is still not the place to go for...
Oh, sure. I just meant relative. I meant
indeed,
relative.
Very relative. Very relative.
But we also just did a study with children aged 5 to 12, and we asked them for their experience with misinformation, of course, together with their parents. And for them, YouTube is the single source where they say they're most exposed to misinformation. And that makes a lot of sense because it's the first source they use and that they also use alone. And YouTube also has these types of recommendation algorithms where it just might happen that you stumble over content that is misleading and irritating. And what I also think it's important to this Ozempic or like skinniness debate more generally, the borders between marketing, advertisement, misinformation, and political statements are really blurred. So some of this content is classical misleading advertisement, which is interesting because the kids in our study, they call that out as misinformation. We're just very used to seeing advertisements that promise things that, as one of our kids said, like cars that are never so clean in reality. That is a clear lie. But we're used to this type of misleading information as adults. But the borders, of course, are very blurred in this social media environment. And that especially comes when it comes to lifestyle products, including the actually kind of abuse of a necessary medicine for getting a slightly bit skinnier on probably risking severe side effects, right?
Yeah. So for me to sum up, and seeing as we're talking about bullshit, and we've used this before on the podcast, but that is Brandolini's law, and that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. And that is what we are up against.
That is indeed what we're up against. And that is one of the big challenges when we want to contribute to a more healthy information environment, that we actually need to ensure that people are well equipped before they come into this environment. And that not only refers to kids and children, but that also especially refers to everyone else. Because what children do, that's also something that we saw in our study, they turn to their parents when they are unsure if you should really, eat scent to become more healthy. They go and ask their parents. So we also really need to make sure that parents are in an environment where they can be these information providers for their children.
Okay, a big thank you to Lena for joining us on The Oral Apothecary, for sharing her stories, her desert island drug, her career anthem, and her book for the Oral Apothecary Library. Coming up next time, we're joined by Professor Sir Gregor Smith, Chief Medical Officer for Scotland. Join us next time on The Oral Apothecary. You can contact us via X at Oral Apothecary. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at oralapothecarypod@gmail.com, the website as well. Gimo now with the final ingredient.
Yeah, please do follow us on LinkedIn because that's where we're spending more of our time these days. Feels like a better and safer environment to interact. So search us up. So on a similar theme, Steve, what was the name of the podcast you went on recently? The Snug, yeah. And so the second, it was in two parts, both really good. The second part was you talking about AI. So what was your phrase?
So I was explaining that AI is plausible
Yeah.
but it lacks perspective for me.
So I just want to talk about a study that actually, I think, backs up what you're saying. So we know that millions of people are turning to AI chatbots for health advice, and actually some of the companies are promoting them as that tool. And it feels authoritative and confident and reassuring to get answers back. But a new study from researchers at the University of Oxford, published in Nature Medicine, decided to test out how reliable that advice really is. So it was a large experiment with 1,300 participants, and each person was given realistic medical scenarios, things like developing a severe headache after a night out, or a new mother suddenly feeling breathless and exhausted. And some of the study used AI chatbots to decide what they should do, and some people were using more traditional methods, so search engines and websites and their own judgment and stuff. And what they found is that the people using AI did no better than the others at making the right decision. And what they found was probably a little bit more worrying than that, because when people interacting with the chatbots, 3 problems kept appearing. Firstly, users didn't know what information to provide. Secondly, the chatbots sometimes gave different answers depending on how the question was phrased. And thirdly, the answers often contained a mix of good advice and bad advice, but they were blended together in ways that the people receiving the information found it hard to tell which was which. So in other words, and I think this goes to your point, Steve, the chatbot sounded convincing even when it was wrong. And what they found was that these LLM models, the large language models, are extremely good at passing tests of medical knowledge, but interacting with real people, messy, emotional, incomplete information and all, is something very different. So it's diagnosing illness isn't just about knowledge, it's about judgment. And that's, as you said, Steve, is something that machines, I think, are still struggling to replicate. And so the study's lead medical practitioner, Dr. Rebecca Payne, who I think we've featured on the podcast before, offered a reminder that we should perhaps all think about. Despite all the hype, AI just isn't ready to take on the role of the physician. Patients need to be aware that asking a large language model about their symptoms can be dangerous, give wrong diagnosis, and fails to recognise when urgent help is needed.
You have been listening to a 3 Apothecaries production. Sound engineer Jimbo Slough, original music Jamie Brewster, artwork by David Baker and Jacob Howard.
Thanks for listening to the Oral Apothecary podcast. Warning, always enjoy with an alcoholic drink, especially if operating machinery.
This episode of the Oral Apothecary is sponsored by onelesspill.com, a medicines optimization consultancy.